Thank you all so much for tuning in to another episode of my show with me, William Wallace, on my show, William Wallace for America. As you all know, I went to CPAC a couple weeks ago in Orlando, Florida. And while in Orlando, while at CPAC, I met somebody. Well, I met a lot of people, but this particular person is something I hold near and dear to my heart, which is our Electoral College. And I did a show a couple years ago about how our Electoral College is under attack. And I hate to say this, but it kind of got, the idea kind of got pushed to the side. I kind of stopped talking about it a little bit. And then while at CPAC, I met this gentleman you'll see here with me is Trent England with Save Our States. Trent, thank you so much for coming on with me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. It's always good to talk about these structures that make our country so successful.
Well, it's interesting because I think a lot of people that don't, I think there's a lot of people that don't know about our Electoral College. And, you can tell because when you hear people talk about, how a president won, they automatically say, well, that president got more votes or that president. And I don't think they really understand it. And then when you really talk about the Electoral College, it brings a recollection to a lot of people. But I think in general, there's even more people that don't even realize how it works and the beauty of how it protects our republic. People think we have a democracy, but I think the way he explains, we use a democratic system, but our democracy is really protected by our Electoral College. Is that the proper way to put it?
Yeah, I think that people mix up, this idea of democracy as a mechanism versus the idea of democracy as an end goal or the whole purpose of government. You get people today talking about democracy as if that's, some kind of standard of right and wrong, or
Yeah.
if a plurality of people want this, then you have to give it to them. But you don't even have to get to the Electoral College. I mean, the Bill of Rights is all about stopping majorities from running over minorities. So everybody supports the Bill of Rights,
Right.
and I think that it's a helpful way to remind people we're not just a democracy. We're something better than that. And republic is a term that I like because I think it captures that. Republics use democratic processes to serve a greater good.
So are we the only country in the world that uses any form of the Electoral College? And now I know we're kind of bouncing around a little bit here, and we're sort of zoning in a little bit more and explaining people from the beginning. But are we the only country in the world that uses that type of
So
democracy?
we're actually not, although the details of our electoral college are unique. There are other countries that have similar kinds of systems. India does in a way. Germany does in a certain way. It's interesting. Both of those constitutions were written just in right around 1950, and so partly looking at our own constitutional system to learn from that and apply those lessons to their own countries, and then every parliamentary system functions in a way as an electoral college when it comes to electing the prime minister. And actually, when the founders wrote our Constitution, the first system, kind of the rough draft of the Constitution called the Virginia Plan, called for us to have a parliamentary system where Congress would have elected the president. And you can kind of think of the Electoral College, and I'm sure we'll get into all these details, but you can kind of think of the Electoral College as a parliamentary system, except that the members of parliament who vote for the president only vote for the president, and then we have this other parliament called Congress that doesn't, right? But the Electoral College is actually based on Congress. Each state has exactly the same amount of power in the Electoral College that it has in Congress. So yeah, it's interesting. There are actually very few major countries, of the countries considered to be democratic nations. Very few major countries use a direct popular election at the national level, probably because of risks that we'll get into here on the program. It's actually not a very good way to do national elections in a really big country.
What's interesting, and I guess you learn things as you go, or it's a kind of a weird way to say this, but even I'm learning something right now because, as you pointed out with India and how Parliament elects their president, I never really thought about the connection between how we were so close to having a parliamentary form of government where Congress elected the president, but it still kind of mirrors where, like you said, we have the same number of electoral votes in a state that we have congressmen, but it's kind of good that they didn't put that with the congressmen, because imagine how much how much power they have now.
Yeah.
Imagine if power was in their control, was in their power to put the president in office also.
And that was the founders' concern. The parliamentary model was already emerging, obviously, at the time of the American Revolution, the American
Right.
founding. And so that was what was out there. So when the delegates gathered in Philadelphia, they had, the Virginia delegates led by Madison had put that into their, Virginia plan.
Mhm.
And yet nobody really liked it because they understood, and this just gets to the way in which the founders really were doing, they were doing things that were radically new and they
Right.
were very innovative. I mean, they took what they had, this parliamentary model, and they didn't like it because they recognized that they wanted more separation of powers, because if you have separation of powers, you can have checks and balances, which means that you can have better built-in protections of liberty. And a parliamentary system really doesn't do that. That's why you've seen the British system over the last, 70 years has swung, into socialism, out of socialism, back towards socialism, back away from
Right.
socialism. These parliamentary systems can go through really radical changes because they don't have the separation of powers that our Constitution provides. And that's really why the founders rejected the parliamentary system, which is helpful when people talk about the Electoral College, because sometimes you'll hear folks on the left talk about it as if it was, they were going to do a popular vote, but they were elitists, or they were going to do a popular vote, but they were racist, or the slave states, demanded that they do something different. It's just not the truth. They were going to have a parliamentary system, and they wanted to better protect liberty. And so they did talk about potentially having a direct election, but ultimately they came up with the Electoral College as a kind of middle ground that incorporates the best of both, but avoids the worst of both.
I like this. So how did they actually get to a point where they figured out the system where the electoral it was the people in this each state were chosen to be delegates to the Electoral College?
Yeah, it's a really interesting story when you go back to the debates at the Constitutional Convention, because they assemble in the first week. They're not even sure if they're going to have one president or maybe a council of presidents or something like that. They really quickly decide it's going to be one person. That is something that's resolved within the first few days of the convention. But then the question is, how do you choose this person? And this is a big deal because the United States, under the Articles of Confederation, had never, we didn't have that kind of executive leadership.
Right.
And so, there's a really funny, to me, funny point in the notes of the convention where James Wilson, says, well, it should be one person. And then there's just kind of silence because people really weren't sure. And Benjamin Franklin steps in and says, well, let's not just have a vote on this. Let's actually talk through, what is this executive office supposed to be? And Wilson, the day after that, after they'd resolved that, they did decide it's going to be one person, Wilson says, I don't like this parliamentary model. I like the idea of a direct election in some ways, but I recognize that has some flaws too. So how about we have a system where each state chooses some delegates and those delegates would vote for president? And at that point, the discussion started, they say, okay, well, that's an interesting idea. We'll talk about that later. And it's not until, that's in May of 1787. It's not until the end of August and really the beginning of September, at the end of the summer, when James Wilson from Pennsylvania, James Madison from Virginia, and a handful of other delegates really sit down and figure out, okay, what is this thing that we now call the Electoral College? They didn't use that term for it. And yeah, they hammered this out as, a kind of a compromise, but really, that doesn't quite do it justice, because once they came up with it, a lot
Right.
of people looked at it, even people who were against other parts of the Constitution, even the anti-federalists who didn't want the new Constitution at all. They
Right.
still looked at the Electoral College and said, well, that part is actually pretty good. That part we actually
Yeah.
think is pretty good. So yeah, they really they debated this on and off for 3 months, and the brightest minds at the convention are the ones who really developed the idea, put it down on paper right in the waning days, and and then at the end, Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers is able to write, if it be not perfect, it is at least excellent. So,
Well, what's interesting about that is it's the delegates in the Electoral College, in my opinion, is a unique blend of our federal government, state rights, and then of course it's all dictated by the people and the
yeah.
population within a state, and it's kind of where it involved the delegates, and who developed that system you said with the delegates. That was
So James Wilson from Pennsylvania was the first to suggest that. Yeah.
Yeah. So they developed a system where the delegates are chosen in the state, and how are the delegates in a state chosen now?
So the way that it's written in the Constitution, the power is just given to state legislatures. So it's up to each state's legislature to decide how they choose that their own state's presidential electors.
Mhm.
And originally, some state legislatures just said, "Well, we're going to choose. We're going to appoint them directly," and that was done up until the 1820s, and then Colorado, right after Colorado joined the Union in 1876, they appointed their own presidential electors because they didn't have time to have another election.
Right.
Uh, but other than that, most states very quickly began holding elections. So they said, we're going to let the people of our state vote. They're going to choose our presidential electors. Some of them did it by district, and they literally would have presidential elector districts in the state, and they would, you would vote for your presidential elector district's elector, and that would end up casting one electoral vote for president. But pretty quickly, the states began trending toward the system that 48 states have now, which is winner take all, because that maximizes the power of your state, right? So,
Mm.
here in Oklahoma, where I am, if 55% of the people vote for Donald Trump, then Donald Trump gets all 7 of our presidential electors and if their electoral votes. That's the system that Virginia sort of famously adopted in the election of 1800, because they felt like Jefferson would have won in 1796, but they had split up their electoral votes, and so to give the Democratic Republicans more power in 1800, they went winner take all, and Jefferson, of course, won, although just by the skin of his teeth. But yeah, so ever
He was
since the
tightest
states.
election before George W. Bush, I think.
What's that?
Before George W. Bush's 271 electoral vote win, the Jefferson one, I think, was that you just mentioned, was the previously the tightest or the closest election ever.
Yeah, arguably the closest. I think 1824, 1876.
Right.
Maybe you could throw in there, but yeah, I mean certainly the election of 1800 was a nail biter in several different ways, and one of the nastiest elections we've ever seen in our history. But
You really studied this a whole lot, haven't you? You're
yeah.
really good on this stuff.
Oh, thank you. No, it's
So
I love it because one of the things you find about the Electoral College is that the founders were very curious. They were, their curiosity drove their innovation, and their curiosity also after the fact in how this would really work, because they weren't quite sure what states would do.
mm,
There was some speculation that the Electoral College most of the time would just deadlock. And if it deadlocked,
right.
it would throw the election to the House. And so the Electoral College would sort of nominate candidates for president, and then the House would decide. But it turned out that, other than 1800 and 1824, that has never happened.
Yeah.
And, as soon as states started allowing the people to choose their state's presidential electors, it turned into what is actually a very democratic process. It's a two-step democratic process.
Right.
But all the power rests with the people in every state. I mean, it's arguably it's more democratic than a country like France, where they do have a direct election for president, but they do it in two stages. Ours is two stages really geographically, theirs is two stages chronologically. And, the current president of France had support from 23% of French voters in the first round of their election. So,
Yeah.
some people look at our system and say, hey, that American way is actually a lot more democratic than systems that claim to be, very, very democratic.
Right. Very democratic and not constitutional republic, right?
Yeah.
So what I like about this is you've just now set the stage where we've talked about how the legislators or the legislative bodies in each state are the ones that are that are deciding how the electors are chosen. And so I know we're going to come back to that because it's part of what's going on with the attack on our electoral college. Is that correct?
That's right.
And we'll talk about that in a few minutes, I'm sure. But let's give a brief description for bring people up to speed, and for those that are watching or listening that aren't really familiar with how it works. So now that they figure out how to choose the electors in each college, what's the basic description of how the electoral college works? Can we do a 101 on that real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. So it really starts with political parties in each state. I think this is important to understand because people oftentimes ask, well, who are these presidential electors, right? Like, where do these people come from?
Right.
And the reality is, they're your neighbors, they're people in your own state. So in Louisiana, the Louisiana Democratic Party and the Louisiana Republican Party in early 2024 will hold their state conventions. And at those state conventions in the presidential election year, they will nominate people to be their party's presidential electors. So here in Oklahoma, I mean, I have friends and acquaintances who were nominated to be among the Republican and actually among the Democrat as well, presidential electors. And when you have the presidential election then in November, whichever party's candidate gets the most votes in your state, that party's slate of electors are elected, and they're actual state, really state and federal elected officials. As you said, William, it's kind of an interesting synthesis. I mean, they're acting on behalf of the state, but they're fulfilling a federal constitutional purpose. And those people then, according to statute, they will gather in December and they cast the electoral vote for president, and then they cast the electoral vote for vice president. And those things then go to Congress. They're counted up in Congress, and the election is decided. And so that's the basic process that, as I mentioned,
270 votes to win right now.
It takes. Yeah, that's right. You have to win with a majority. If nobody has a majority, then it goes to Congress.
Right now, the majority is 270. I think that number changes a little bit as our populations change and the number of congressmen in each state change.
That's
I know,
right.
like Louisiana, we just had redistricting, so there was concern whether we were going to lose a district or not, and so they're watching that and they're deciding whether or not there's going to be, so that if that happens in I guess enough states, the number actually changes, but the overall population of the United States is growing, so that number can only get bigger, as we go.
Well, since for the last little more than 100 years, it's been capped, which is an interesting debate that people have, is whether they should allow that number to go up and, there to be more seats in the House of Representatives, which I actually think would be a good idea. That's obviously a topic for another day.
Right, exactly. So the electoral, are there any other good scenarios of the Electoral College that you want to discuss before we talking about, how our Electoral College is under attack? And why?
I'd love to throw out there the ways in which this is beneficial, because I think oftentimes, if you're a voter in Baton Rouge or in rural Louisiana or wherever, it's very intuitive. The Electoral College kind of puts a limit on the power of big cities, right? And that's a good thing.
Right.
And James Madison said at the Constitutional Convention that was basically one of the reasons we needed an Electoral College. So that's very intuitive. But I would like to highlight a couple of the other benefits One is, goes along with what we're talking about. It keeps elections controlled at the state level. So you don't need some federal bureaucracy run by a presidential appointee to be in charge of presidential elections, right? Each state runs them on their own, and that also means that if there is incompetence in a state, like New York, oftentimes in the last 15 years,
Right.
they have a hard time counting all their votes on time, and they've actually turned in kind of formal election documents that are missing as many as a couple 100,000 votes from their tally. At least it's contained in New York, right? New York's results only affect New York's electoral votes. Nothing that happens in New York can affect how Louisiana casts their electoral votes.
Right.
If there's vote fraud in Chicago, let's say, all it
Imagine
could
that.
affect.
Voter
What's that?
fraud.
I
Voter
know.
fraud. Imagine that.
The Chicago cemeteries can only affect the where Illinois' electoral votes go. They can't affect the electoral votes here in Oklahoma. So this does help to contain some of the disputes, some of the lawsuits. You never need a nationwide recount with the Electoral College. All those, I think, are kind of obvious good things.
And not only that, I guess, but and not to interrupt you, but I guess what came to my mind was, now if Illinois decides that if they have election problems, then their few number of electoral votes doesn't affect our election. I mean, granted, in a narrow win, or a narrow race, that their electoral votes could affect who wins the presidency. But when you look at overall, it's not as big of a change or as big of as much leverage as other states, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. And typically, I used to work in public policy around election integrity issues, and typically where you see the biggest problems with election fraud is in one party jurisdictions. And so the reality is, right, Illinois, the reason why people are concerned about Illinois having vote fraud is because Illinois is basically a one party state, right? Which means there's not a lot of oversight from Republicans because Republicans are mostly locked out of power there. And, the corollary is Illinois is probably going to go to the Democrats anyway. So Illinois is not a state where it makes a lot of sense for the Democrats to try to steal votes in a presidential race, even though that's one of the states where they might have the power to do that. Whereas
Right.
in a really tight state, there's going to be more accountability. There's going to be more Republican officials. And so it's a lot harder to conduct election fraud in these, whatever happens to be the swing states at the moment. So I think that does help to kind of limit that effect. But the one last thing I would say is, about the benefits of the Electoral College. The reason why other countries use similar kinds of systems is because if you don't, you really run a risk of having politics become very fractured, very regional, having people win with small plurality support. And, and that's just unhealthy for any country, right?
Right.
What you want is your political forces to sort of pull you together and force your candidates to reach out beyond their strongholds. And the Electoral College really does that. The Democrats are, they're a national party. The Republicans are a national party. The Libertarians and the Greens, right? I mean,
Right.
everybody's trying to run a truly national political party. And a lot of that's because of the Electoral College.
So because I like to ask questions in various different ways, I might ask the same question for the same information in different ways, for the listeners. So the real beauty of the Electoral College over national vote. So I'm asking, I guess, to directly compare. We've kind of alluded around why the Electoral College is better than a national vote, but directly asking you, what are some of the distinct advantages between national vote and electoral college vote?
Yeah, I mean, if you just have one direct election system, the parties are going to tend to play to their strengths, right? So, the Democrats are going to tend to focus on the cities. Republicans are going to tend to focus more on, on just the rural areas. You get less outreach, and you also allow parties to be regional, right? The Democrats could say, look, we don't. I mean, why would we put much of a focus on any area other than the coasts, right? I mean, if you look at the metro areas in our country, the way they're defined by the Census Bureau, half the population lives in the 43 biggest metros. So, I
Wow.
mean, yeah, that's a lot of
Yeah,
that's a lot of
that's
people.
serious, right?
I mean, you got 10 million people. I went to college in Los Angeles County. There's 10 million people who live
How'd you
in
do that? I'm
Washington.
rolling my eyes. How'd you do
I
that?
know. No, there's 10 million people who live there, right? I mean, that is bigger than Louisiana and Oklahoma combined.
Yeah,
Uh, so the the population disparities really come into play in a direct vote system, and at that point you have to have something like HR1, S1, where the federal government takes control of elections. All that power is pushed up to Washington D.C. I mean, I think all those are bad things, and I
right.
don't think they're just bad for Republicans. I think they're bad for Republicans and Democrats and every American who doesn't want our politics to become even more divisive, even more bitter, even more sort of one size fits all, where one faction wins and everybody else loses. The great thing about federalism is, California can have all kinds of crazy public
Right.
policy from my
Yeah,
perspective.
exactly.
Yeah, I don't want it in Oklahoma, right? And with the Electoral College, we kind of protect that system, and I think anything that protects that system is a good thing.
So two other questions. I got a whole bunch of questions, but one, who benefits the most from the Electoral College? You've kind of alluded to that, but I want to get a direct answer. But how does the Electoral College then protect those groups of people? Why is that? I'm asking again. I understand. How does that make it? How does the Electoral? Well, who does it protect the most? I'll let you answer that, and then how does it safeguard them the best?
Yeah. So I think the really obvious beneficiary of the Electoral College, really anybody who lives outside of a major metro area or a major media market, right? Because whether the candidates are talking to you directly or not, they're talking to people like you, right? They're not just
Right.
focusing on people around LA and Houston and Chicago and New York, right? They're talking to people in some small town somewhere. And if you live in a small town anywhere, you're better off because of that. I think the other beneficiaries who are less obvious, but frankly, there used to be a lot more focus on this back in the 1960s and 70s when there were debates about the Electoral College, is, you know, I'm going to say minority groups, but I think that conjures up something very specific to race. It might be about race, but it might be about profession. There was a little flap during the last campaign about lobstermen in Maine, because there are a couple thousand people in Maine who are professional lobster fishermen, and they support a decent part of the Maine economy. And the Trump administration actually had some kind of focused outreach to them, trying to make sure that they were included in some public policies. And some of the Democrats, and actually some of the folks who were anti-electoral college, pointed to this and said, "Isn't that terrible? Because the Trump administration is just doing this because they're trying to win that one electoral vote in Maine, and isn't that horrible?" And I thought, how crazy is that? Isn't it
Yeah.
wonderful that we have a political system that gives lobstermen in Maine a voice
A
in
voice.
D.C.?
Right. Exactly.
It's not like, yeah, I mean, because what's the argument on the other side, that Google and Facebook and Amazon aren't getting enough attention, right?
Right.
That
Exactly.
I
Right.
mean,
Yeah.
it's yeah, I just, me and my colleagues who defend the Electoral College, we were really kind of amazed by that, because to us it's the beauty of our system.
Right.
But yeah,
Well,
to other
well,
people, they look at it and they see a problem.
something comes to my mind that I think that people have a hard time seeing how good our electoral college is, or how much it, like you said, protects not only minorities, but people in small groups, whether it's race,
Yeah,
religion, where they live or what their profession is. People in smaller groups get a bigger voice.
yeah,
But I think that because we've never had another system, people don't realize how much the electoral college protects the little guy. People, because we've always had the electoral college, people don't see the beauty of it, because there's those narratives on why it's not good.
yeah,
There's narratives on why we shouldn't have it, and there's, like you said earlier in the interview, that some people say it's racist or it's hateful or whatever the case may be. But because we've always had it, people don't realize that the reason why a presidential candidate goes all over the country and not just the big cities, but the small cities and talks to the small groups is because when you run for president, you probably have a better understanding of the Electoral College and how important it is. I'll give you an example. Everybody sees this. Everybody in the Obama one and when Biden won, everybody looks at that map of the United States. And of course, where red equals Republican and blue equals Democrat, and they see the land mass, 90% of the land mass of the United States is red. And then they see Los Angeles, Chicago, they see smaller areas that are blue. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I'm doing that to make the point. And that actually makes the point of the Electoral College. Imagine if a person ran for office and he wasn't speaking to those people. And that's the beauty of Electoral College is even when the bigger areas win because they have such high populations. Imagine if we didn't have the Electoral College, those population centers would win every time. And so to your point, I think that it protects the small person. So
and that's, I think that some Americans would be surprised at the things that other countries have done to try to program those protections into their own systems. I mean, one of the fascinating things is the system in Lebanon, where they have significant factions of different Muslim factions and actually different Christian factions, and those different groups are guaranteed a certain amount of political power in their system, right? Where if the prime minister is from one group, then then another official has to be from the other group, which is really interesting. That very much is not democratic,
right.
But they do that because there's a real concern that if one group happens to be 55% and the other group is 45%, and there's a lot of people in those groups who don't really like each other very much, or maybe they don't like each other a lot. You don't want the 55% to be able to tyrannize 45%, just even though they're a Democratic majority. And so we have this system where we're not guaranteeing that Republicans get some power or Democrats get some power. We're not guaranteeing that rural people get some power or whatever. We're just sort of pushing everybody to listen to more voices, to campaign in more places. And we're putting an upper limit on how much power any individual big city or coalition of big states can have. And, I think it's a great system. But as you say, people tend to just look at it in the moment and see whether their candidate's winning or losing. And, and then it's easy to say, well, if my candidate's losing,
candidate got the national vote, they didn't win. Well, But I think that a lot of people take our system for granted, and they don't realize the beauty of the Electoral College because we've never had anything else. But I want to start focusing more on not only your organization, but what I advertised, for our show is that our Electoral College is under attack.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of people don't realize that because the Democrats and I'm I don't want to blame on the Democrats. Look, let me put this. My disclaimer is this: we can blame the Democrats for a lot of things, but I blame a lot of the Republicans for doing nothing. And there's a lot of Republicans in office who have done nothing, or they've done opposite of what they said they were going to do. So I'm not just saying it's all the Democrats' fault. I'm saying that it's the establishment's fault on both sides of the fence. And I think that the Democrat Party are more of the ones that are coming up with ways to erode the foundation of our Electoral College. That not eliminate it, but erode it, because it goes back to something you said earlier, which I know you'll bounce off of in a minute. But many Republicans aren't doing anything about it. So it's up to us, the people, to be able to have organizations like yours, Save Our States, and make it aware that, hey, we have a beautiful system. Here's what's happening. Here's how we can stop it. So what is happening right now? I know it's happening in a couple of different ways. So I'll let you talk about that.
Yeah, so I mean, this is an area where I have to give folks on the left a lot of credit. They've been very savvy in how they've gone about attacking the as you said, sort of attacking the foundation of the Electoral College, and then trying to manipulate it in a way that is very clever. After Al
I
Gore
could say
lost,
they got rid of the Electoral College.
yeah,
No, they didn't. They just changed the laws to make it work in their favor.
that's right. I mean, after Al Gore lost in 2000, obviously there were a lot of Democrats who were very upset. It's a little ironic, I should say, because the Gore campaign actually thought that it might turn out the other way. They were worried that they were going to lose the popular vote and win the Electoral College. And they actually had a memo drafted up by lawyers about why the Electoral College is a good thing.
Yeah.
So, a little ironic, but they cooked up this idea after the election. What if, they recognize that they would love to get rid of the Electoral College, but you have to amend the Constitution. That's really hard. So they're looking for another way. And they said, what if you got states to pass laws, because the
This is
power,
how it's under. This is how it's under attack.
that's right, the powers with state legislatures, you get states to pass laws to give away their electoral votes. And they would do that by choosing their presidential electors based not on how people vote in their own state, but based on how people vote in the whole country. If you get enough states to do that, while you do leave the Electoral College in place, you force it to rubber stamp the popular vote result. So from their perspective, candidates like Al Gore, candidates like Hillary Clinton would never lose again, because the Electoral College would be manipulated and forced into rubber stamping the popular vote result. So they wrote this into a proposed state law, and they made it what's called an interstate compact, which is an agreement among states. Usually these things are used for water rights or, bridges between states, really mundane things. But they wrote this into an interstate compact that would create an agreement among the states that passed the law that they will all do this if
Right.
they get enough states to pass it that they control that magic 270 electoral votes. Right. So if they would, if they get enough states that they control the outcome of presidential elections, they'll all switch over to this all at once. And, essentially the Electoral College at that point, while it's still functioning, it's basically gone in the sense that you get none of the benefits of the Electoral College. All the things that we've been talking about all get wiped away because it's forced to rubber stamp the popular vote. So that's what they came up with. A fellow named John Koza, some law professors kind of cooked up the idea, but a fellow named John Koza from San Francisco came upon this. He'd been a presidential elector in California in 2000. So he was a big Al Gore supporter, big Democrat funder. He actually invented the scratch-off lottery, the algorithm, like the math behind the scratch-off lottery. He invented that, patented it, made a fortune off of that. I tell people he's the only guy who wins on every scratch ticket.
Right.
But he took his fortune and said, I'm going to make this my cause in life to try to, for all intents and purposes, get rid of the Electoral College. And so he launched the National Popular Vote campaign. They call the law the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And with all of their money, and with, Democrats being frustrated by the 2000 election at that time, they started getting states to pass this law. And, California, Illinois, New York, some of the smaller, really Democrat-leaning states like Hawaii and Vermont and
They've already signed on.
What's that?
Have they already signed on?
Yeah, all those states have signed on.
This is the scary thing about this, where and I'm always going backwards a little bit to help make the connections here, where the little guy in our country, the minority, the small business person, the person that might be in a religion that is is the smallest religion in our country, whatever group somebody fits in, they are protected by our constitutional, our electoral college. But under a democracy, under just a pure democracy, the mob wins, the population wins, and the population centers being in the major cities means that the major cities, which are going broke, by the way, and have the highest crime rates because they have the worst economic policies and they have the worst crime policies, they would now be dictating our laws over our whole country based on just a pure Democratic system that's not protected by the Electoral College. So the Democrats finding a way to where it rubber stamps the popular vote, which they know they can win because they flood in illegals into our country. They give away all the money they can to get people to vote Democrat. Now, to be able to rubber stamp that without saying that they're the ones who got rid of the Electoral College, okay, because you then, if they got rid of it, we would forever be able to say, well, the Democrats got rid of the greatest form of government, and then, as I said earlier, that we Americans don't realize how well or how good the Electoral College is and how much it's protected us because we've always had it. If we let it go and let them take it away and get rid of it, we'll realize in 10, 20 years, or less, or a generation, how good of a system it was, because when you don't have the good thing anymore, boy, you sure miss that good thing when it's gone, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think part of that concern is any attack on the Electoral College, right? All of these suggestions that we need to be something more like a direct democracy. I mean, the reality is they're attacks on our whole system of government, and they're really attacks on the ideas that our system of government is built on, right? Which is that idea, William, that you're talking about, that it's not just majority will, right? It's not, the standard of right and wrong and what should be put into law is not just that, a majority or even a
Right.
plurality
Exactly.
want it, right? We look to something higher. We use democratic elections and mechanisms like that to create representation, to create accountability. But the whole Bill of Rights, as I think I said at the beginning, the whole Bill of Rights is anti-democratic. That's the whole point. The
Right.
Electoral College is a democratic process, but it's got some checks and balances built in there. And yeah, I mean, if we ever move away from that, I think that we will directly feel the pain of not having that system, but we also slide further down this slippery slope away from the whole idea that government is supposed to protect minority rights, protect individual rights, and toward this collectivist mentality that produces a lot of brutality and a lot of abuses.
Well, what's interesting, and again, you're giving me all these good thoughts, and I can't thank you enough, Trey. That's why I'm bringing. That's why I'm enjoying having the conversation. Hopefully, we can keep this going for a little bit longer here,
Yeah.
because when you really think about our government having Congress, Senate, the executive branch, the judicial branch, they're all equal branches of government. It's almost as if the Electoral College is another kind of co-equal branch. I know it's not a branch, but let's just say the significance of the Electoral College is kind of like another co-equal branch in the way of checks and balances. The Electoral College adds a whole nother level of checks and balances because it's not just on a vote of the people, which, as I believe that we saw in the last election. Sorry to say this, but the last election was it was stolen, and it's not a conspiracy thinking when you look at how ballots were ballot boxes were stuffed. I've studied this enough to see that ballot harvesters are for real. They're able to take registrations in cities and states that aren't being used and create ballots for those registrations that aren't being used because they know those people are not going to show up at the polls, and they use those just to create more numbers, to more votes, to be able to get the desired win for a certain election. So that being said, the Electoral College is another way to safeguard our elections. And if we allow it to be just a rubber stamp of the popular vote, then we've taken away one of those checks and balances out of our system, and we're one step closer to not only a majority rule, but to having a king. I mean, I know it's a long shot, but when you get to where you're just a pure democracy and you could get the votes that you need to get the desired outcome that you need without checks and balances, our country is going to be in big trouble. And that's what I think the beauty of the Electoral College is.
Yeah, and this national popular vote plan, I mean, it has no, I mentioned the French system that has at least, that France is the largest major democratic nation that has a direct election for president. That's a stable country. I mean, there are a couple, Mexico, there are
And
a
you
couple
said
other places.
earlier that the president only had 23% of the
Yeah, in the
favor.
first round, and France at least has a runoff. This national popular vote proposal has no runoff, so you would have candidates literally becoming president with 23% of the vote. I mean, potentially less than that, right? I
How's
mean,
that?
that was an election with I think 6 credible candidates. If you had you have Kanye West and you have Michael Bloomberg and you have somebody
Roland
like
Ross
Ross.
Perot.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean exactly. You
right.
could fracture the electorate, and who knows? This is where I think the Democrats are actually really short-sighted because I don't think that this national popular vote plan. I don't think it helps. It certainly doesn't help Republicans, but I don't think it really helps Democrats. I think it hurts everybody because I mean, imagine
People are
right
the
now.
ones who are going to lose.
What's that?
The people will be the ones that lose.
Yeah, that's right. I mean,
So,
at least Joe Biden went through the process of becoming the Democratic Party's nominee, campaigning around the country. He has a lot of support, right, in places like California and Illinois and New York,
yeah.
places we've been talking about, right? He actually has a lot of supporters. I mean, imagine if we had an election where, at the very end, some celebrity who's not really well known, not really tested, steps in and spends $500 million. And because we have 8 candidates running, you have this celebrity who wins with 16% of the vote or 20% of the vote.
Yeah,
And
that's
now
right.
we're potentially, we're in a situation where we're trying to stay out of nuclear war,
Right.
right?
And
You
and
know,
and the TikTok star that's been doing videos, was was able to
yeah.
become president of the United
No,
States.
I mean, I think the founders were so smart because they understood that the way you design election systems has a lot to do with the way that the kinds of people who win, the way they conduct themselves in office, because you're creating that accountability, you're creating that
Mhm.
representation. And, I mean, if any of the founders looked at this national popular vote plan, I think they'd be horrified.
Well, when I bring
Um,
up go ahead, finish.
yeah, no, no, go ahead.
No, that's why I brought up about the last election. I mean, there are a lot of people, there's even Republicans who hate it when you say the last election was stolen. However, every election jokes about the dead voting, and even some of the smartest Republicans that I know will joke about the dead voting, or they'll joke about ballot harvesting. But because because the establishment did not want Trump in office again, they're happy to say that the last election was not stolen because they got the desired outcome that they wanted, which was just not to have Trump in office. And the reason I'm bringing that up as an example is not to use this moment as a platform to say that I think that the last election had problems. Instead, I'm using that as an example as to why the Electoral College is so important. Because if you did not have the Electoral College, I know I'm repeating a little bit, but we're covering some, I kind of start expanding the thought a little bit more as I go. If we didn't have the Electoral College, you could have stolen elections, like you said, all over the place. You could have, the national election being won by somebody with 16% of the vote who is virtually unknown. And you could have somebody winning it because they just got real effective at having ballot boxes stuffed all over the country, with just their, the illegal ballots, doing ballot harvesters.
Yeah, I mean, the smaller those percentages get, the potential, the likelihood of smaller margins increases. And so the potential for fraud to swing the outcome of an election goes up too. So, I think I mean, what you're saying is
Right.
just mathematically true, right? There's no
Yeah.
question about that.
And so again, the Electoral College protects that. And I repeat this over because on a long show, sometimes people tune in in 1 minute, and we kind of catch them up sometimes with just a good statement like that. So let's go back to where we are right now on a national level. How many states or have changed their laws to go but to rubber stamp the popular vote, which eliminates the Electoral College in their states. And then later, and as we after that, I'd like for you to talk about what your organization is doing to stop that process, to protect our Electoral College. And then one of the last things I'm gonna follow up with, I'm gonna re-ask all these questions, is how can we reverse those states that have done that already? Is there a way to do that?
Yeah.
Which I know there is, but maybe they'll see
Yeah.
the beauty of this. So where are we right now in the states that have changed to rubber stamp the electoral?
Yeah, at this moment, there are 15 states plus the District of Columbia that have passed national popular vote laws. Those states control 195 of the 270 electoral votes that they would need to put this into effect. So they're about 72%, almost three-quarters of the way
Wow.
to, what I view as hijacking the Electoral College. That's sometimes how I describe it, because I think that's true.
That's exactly right.
They're trying to manipulate the Electoral College to do exactly the opposite of what it was designed to do. And I had been interested in the Electoral College since the 1990s. And obviously, when the 2000 election happened, this became something a lot of people were interested in, and started working on it a little bit, thinking about it a little bit more. I have a friend named Tara Ross who has written several books about the Electoral College. And then we came across this National Popular Vote campaign. They launched their effort in 2006. They started winning states right away. And we started going out, testifying in state legislatures, writing articles, going on great programs like this, and just trying to educate people about what was going on and the dangers. And I launched Save Our States in 2009 because I was.
You started it?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, I was really concerned that this is a hard issue to work on, because on the one hand, the Electoral College is a national issue, right? It's in the Constitution.
Right.
And so a lot of the groups in our state capitals weren't focused on it because that's not what they do. But the whole fight is in state capitals. And so, groups like the Heritage Foundation, where I used to work, they weren't engaging in it directly because they don't work in state capitals, or at that time, they didn't work in state capitals. So I created Save Our States to bridge that gap, to coordinate all these allies, national groups and state groups. And, we're really proud because when we started this national popular vote, they were winning states very quickly. They were gaining support even among some Republican legislators.
Because they go in and they say, "Come on, we're a democracy," right?
Yeah.
Not people realize that we're a constitutional republic, so we should have the popular vote, right?
Well, they national popular vote. I mean, they have a lot of money. George Soros' son, Jonathan Soros, kicked in a couple $1 million right away. They were taking state legislators on all expenses paid trips to 5-star resorts on tropical islands. I mean, this was the most.
Our country's being sold out to 5-star resort.
Yeah. I mean, it was the most expensive lobbying campaign at the state capital level that I've ever seen. And but when we started, we looked at this, and national popular vote was winning states at a trajectory where they would have had enough states by the beginning of 2016 to hit 270 electoral votes and put this into effect for the 2016 election. Like that was, if you just chart that out, that was where they were headed. And we were able to launch and slow them down to the point where they almost stopped winning states altogether until the 2016 election. And then all of a sudden, of course, the left ramped up their efforts on this, and they had a good election in 2018. Right. And they added 5 more states in 2018, 2019. And so now we have to ramp up our efforts, and we're doing so much more, work than I ever thought we would have to do. But, we made a documentary. I think I got the poster over my shoulder here. I wrote a book last year. I mean, we're just doing everything we can to educate state legislators, educate other policymakers, and really my heart is to educate the American people about this beautiful, brilliant system that we have in our Constitution that has allowed our nation to be so successful.
Right.
There's no country in the history of the world on the scale of the United States that's had the kind of success that we have had in terms of freedom and prosperity and
Mhm.
innovation, and we risk it all when we start manipulating, tinkering with our Constitution.
And to your point, what has protected the individual rights and those freedoms and liberties that are in our Bill of Rights is our Electoral College. And that being under attack makes a direct line to our freedoms and liberties and the success of our country. Like you said, I believe that the success of our country is directly related to our Electoral College. So how do we stop it? I mean, or how? I mean, now are you? What's your campaign to stop it? And then that's the second part of the second question I had. And then of course next I'm gonna ask you, what can we do to reverse it, if anything?
Yeah.
How do we stop this?
So the way to stop it is with state legislators, and we have had a lot of success with Republicans when we just educate them about what's going on, right? I mean, you walk people through this, mostly they get it. And we've even had some success with Democrats explaining to them, Democrats, they may not like the Electoral College, but they can still understand why this national popular vote plan would be bad for the country. And we've
Right.
had some who say, hey, look, I disagree with you on the Electoral College. I wish we could amend the Constitution and do something different, but we will vote against this national popular vote plan because we recognize it's uniquely dangerous. So I'll take that.
Yeah.
That's a win.
But
Uh,
the only thing a national vote protects is politicians who want to stay in office,
yeah.
which is directly against what the average American wants. The average American is tired of these, lifelong politicians, that have made a career out of politics, and they become part of this establishment, and you can't vote them out because they're just so ingrained in the system, and they're running our national debt up is over $30 trillion now, and it's because of these elected officials that don't care about people or individual rights. They care about getting reelected, and money is not money to them anymore. The national debt is not money to them anymore. Money at that point is just an instrument for them to stay elected and be able to help other of their buddies stay elected. So when you eliminate the Electoral College, you're only going to be able to perpetuate lifelong establishment Republicans and the running up of the national debt, which we're going to have to pay off. And that's the other thing that I think the Electoral College protects is our national debt and keep establishment Republicans out of office.
Well, it's certainly, shifting away from the Electoral College to a national popular vote would make money a lot more important in presidential elections, because it would become more about who can bombard the big media markets with the most advertisements, who can do the get out the vote in those big cities. Even some of the national popular vote advocates admit that it would make presidential politics more expensive. And to the extent that it's more expensive, it is more in the hands of the establishment. So I think that's right. And you asked about, can we roll it back? I mean, it's a state law, so states can repeal this. We're hoping, obviously, I'm sure
Yeah.
you're hoping, your listeners are hoping that this fall's election is going to be really good. That conservative constitutionalist
Mhm.
candidates
Right.
are going to do really well. And if that happens in states like, say, Colorado or New Mexico, we can repeal this in those states. We can start moving it back the other direction. And for people in states that have not joined national popular vote, there are things that those states can do. The easiest is to get the state legislature to pass a resolution, and we've had some states that have done this, that says we are against national popular vote. We want the Electoral College, and if this national popular vote thing, if other states try to put it into effect, our state will bring a lawsuit. We will challenge it because we think it's unconstitutional. That's something states can do, and states can also put in their own state constitutions provisions that prevent their state from ever joining national popular vote. So we're trying to do that right now in Oklahoma. The law would basically look like this. It would say only, well, and there's kind of multiple good things that we can do with this. That the law says only citizens of the United States who are residents of, Oklahoma or residents of Louisiana can vote in our elections. and I always tack on there, including elections for presidential electors. You put that in a state constitution, and the state can never give away our electoral votes, right? We can never let
Yeah.
California voters choose our presidential electors. So hopefully Oklahoma is going to do that. I know Missouri's been considering something like that. South Dakota passed our resolution last year. Arizona's been considering it. Georgia's been considering it. Yeah, there's a lot that we can do to go on offense and start pushing back against this really dangerous national popular vote proposal.
And is there a path to get states that have already had it, that are already doing national popular vote? Is there a way to get them to? I know it goes to the legislature, so I'm re-asking the question just a little bit differently, trying to get a slightly different answer or more information, because sometimes when you ask the same question twice, you get not a different answer, but you get different information.
Yeah.
It leads to the same answer, but different information. So is I guess after you've kind of solidified the states, like you just now talked about, these states are going to sign these resolutions to where electoral college is essentially protected in their state. Is there a way to go back and start lobbying? I mean, not
Yeah.
lobbying in a bad way, but is there a way to go back and try to get those states that have national popular vote systems in place? Is there a way to get them to reverse it?
Yeah.
Or is
Yeah.
it simply getting a Republican legislature to take over, or convincing enough Democrats that, hey, that thing you got last time isn't really good. Let's reverse that.
Yeah,
Right?
we're doing both. I mean, obviously, if you get more, you get more constitutionalists elected to a legislature, it's going to be better for us. But we have had some conversations with Democrats, partly because some of these states, Massachusetts, Hawaii, they joined the compact more than 10 years ago. Most of the state legislators have come since then, so they don't even know their state has passed this. And we're trying to talk to Democrats in those states and help them sort of, at least raise the question, hey, do you know that your state is in this? Have you
Right.
really thought it through? Obviously we think that they should reconsider, and any state can repeal it. So yeah, that's always high on our agenda, is to try to get states to do that. And for your listeners, we have an email list. We have a couple of email lists. One just sends out information to people, but we have an email list for people who want to be more engaged, where we send out information on, here's an article that was written somewhere. Here's how you send letters to the editor, and here's some arguments to make to rebut that, or here's what's going on in the legislature over here. It really, the other side, they've got the money to take people to fancy resorts and do all this stuff.
Yeah,
We don't
right.
have that, and
Sell our
frankly, even if we
country out.
did, we that's not what we would do, right? I mean, ultimately, the Constitution doesn't defend itself, right? It's a brilliant document, but it's only as good as the people who are willing to come out and defend it. And so, really, our mission fundamentally is to educate and activate people, work with people, to stand in the gap and defend our Constitution.
Well, that's what I really enjoy about what you all are doing, and that's why I want to be a part to help promote this even more, so people can see that our electoral college is under attack, regardless of who won, the last election or the election before that, or what you think the real outcome was, or if you're happy with the outcome or what the outcome might have been, or you aren't unhappy that the election got stolen because you're happy that the other guy that you got in was better, or you liked him more, whatever the case may be. I know it's all over the board on all those descriptions, but the reality is, no matter where you are, the Electoral College is a more pure system that protects our democracy and our Constitution, and most importantly, our Bill of Rights. And regardless of who you want to win or who you would have liked to have won, regardless of those sentiments, that overall, what's kept our country in place for over 200 years, and has protected our Bill of Rights and protected our personal liberties, is the Electoral College. And so no matter what happens in the future, without our Electoral College, we deteriorate quicker than we would like to have happen. Is that
Yeah.
something proper to say?
No, I think that's right. I mean, the Electoral College is right there in the, among the foundational elements of our Constitution, the founders recognized that it's these structures that really are the safeguard of our liberties. And
The pillars of our Constitution.
that's right. And so, I think it's ironic that sometimes recently it has been people on the political left who are more focused on changing those structures because they understand that if you write the rules, you'll get the outcome you want, right? And I think sometimes, William, you've said it so well. We have taken these things for granted because they've always been there. And
Mhm.
so conservatives get really focused on the outcomes that we want. And the other side is over here, they may not be talking about the outcomes. They're over here trying to rewrite the rules. And, we've got to shift our focus to defending the rules, or else we will eventually lose the outcomes no matter what. Because if the other side rewrites the
Right.
rules, yeah, we're done.
No, now I guess you added to that, added to the saying, he who counts the votes, controls the outcome. He who writes the rules
Yeah,
also controls the outcome, and
yeah,
and they're trying to write them in their favor. Well, a couple things to wrap up here. One, how can people get involved with your organization? Do you want to talk about where they
yeah,
can see the book? I think a couple of the letters on the screen on my end don't show the whole name of the book. How to find the book, how to find the video, how can people, yeah, it's opposite.
there we go.
There you go. Yeah. So,
So,
how people can get involved, how people can find out more information, and that's the first
yeah.
question to wrap up.
So the documentary is called Safeguard. Safeguard, an Electoral College story. It's on the streaming service Tubi. It's also on the Amazon video streaming service. Folks can go find it, share it. If you watch it and you like it, I'd love it if you write a positive review. That actually really helps us on
It
Amazon.
explains everything we've talked about.
Yeah, it does. It goes through all of these arguments about, where the Electoral College came from. And it's really rich for, for if you've got high school students or college students or anybody who wants to understand, like, what's the story behind the Electoral College. So that's the film. And yeah, it's a lot of fun from my perspective. And then I wrote a book that folks can also find in bookstores. They can find it on Amazon. The title is very straightforward. It's titled "Why We Must Defend the Electoral College." So folks search for why we must defend the Electoral College. That will pop up there, and it's a really little book. It's 40 pages long.
Oh, that's awesome.
Because I wanted it to just be something really easy for people to
I love
read,
that.
get the whole argument. And then saveourstates.com is our website. Folks can sign up for our email list there, find our social media. It's individual people who are the strength of what we do. So yeah, saveourstates.com is the place to connect.
So one last
Yeah,
question before I wrap up here. I mean, after I wrap up, I want to, and we go offline. I'm going to talk to you on camera offline for another minute or two. But one last question I ask everybody on my show is, what unites us as Americans? What is something that we all unite on? I used to ask two questions: what unites Americans, and what makes our country great? What makes the United States America? And sometimes those questions or the answers kind of overlap or they lead into each other. So I think that what unites Americans, because ultimately on my show, while people know that I'm certainly right of center, I always tell people that, that people that are Democrats have good ideas too. And
mhm.
I have Democrats, friends of mine that are good friends of mine that are more Republican than some of my Republican conservative friends. So what I like to try to find is those things that unite us as Americans that we can all come together on. And that's my last question for you.
I think one of the things that unites Americans is our optimism, and we really are an optimistic people. And I think you see that among, obviously when you get to the political class, there are some people who are just very crass and very craven. But I think, yeah, you're run-of-the-mill Democrat, right? How are they convinced to support Bernie Sanders? They're convinced to support somebody like Bernie Sanders because he creates this optimistic view that we're Americans and so therefore we can finally do socialism right, even though everybody
Right.
else has done it wrong, you know?
Yeah. Because
So
we're
no,
more, yeah, exactly. I love that. Right.
yeah, I mean, we look ahead to the future and expect it to that we can make it better than the past, and I think that's been a powerful force for good, not just in our country but in the whole world.
I love that answer because, like you said, I never thought about that. Why some people can support somebody like Bernie Sanders, or why people can support a Democrat, or for the with the bad ideas, or like Ocasio Cortez has a bad idea, or any Democrat that has a bad idea. Look, and and Democrats aren't the only ones with the bad ideas. There's a lot of
That's
Republicans
right.
with bad ideas. So how can somebody support those people with bad ideas? And that was a great answer. It's because of optimism, because somewhere in somebody's heart, they believe that that person is really, or that idea is, and the way it was sold is going to be the way to do it. Well, Trent, I want to thank you so much for coming on air with me. Any final thought? Any last words?
No, I just want to thank you, William. I mean, what you're doing right here, right? This is the cutting edge of saving our country because every time we educate one person, and from the perspective of listeners, right? Every time we educate ourselves and we make ourselves a little bit better at persuading other people to support our Constitution, to
Mhm.
defend our country, to stand up against these bad ideas. I mean, that is the continuation of the American
Right.
Revolution. That is the continuation of the fight for liberty. So that we're doing it right here, and I'm thankful to be a part of it.
I love it. Trent, thank you so much. After I end here, we'll talk for one more second. I want to thank everybody for tuning into the show, and thank everybody for sharing it. Of course, this link is going to be on Facebook. It's going to be on YouTube. It's going to be on Rumble, all of them at William Wallace for America. Of course, you see how it's spelled across the bottom, and I always say it's WALLIS because people still will misspell it. But it's amazing. I know. So I'll repeat it a little bit, but and this will also be as a podcast. So if you just want to listen to it, share it with somebody, send it to somebody, and show them the beauty, explain the beauty of our Electoral College, and explain why it needs to be saved. Just say, hey, listen to this podcast. And again, thank you all very much. And everybody else have a great day. And by the way, those who are listening, our next show is coming up in just about 30 minutes. So hang on tight, and we'll see you in a little bit.